Good morning. We're glad you've joined us for the Sunday morning service of Tusculum Hills Baptist Church, a caring and vibrant church that offers God's help to all people. We invite you to join us now for a special message.
But I'm going to invite you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 6. And as you're turning there, let me tell you a little bit more about why this is one of my favorite passages. It's going to deal with the subject of distraction. Does anybody here have distraction in your life? Can I get a witness, they say? Now, don't point to somebody next to you like I just saw somebody doing. We all have different things that distract us. And sometimes those things that distract us may be more diabolical, maybe a satanic attack. Sometimes they are things that perhaps because of some lack of discipline in our life, we find ourselves distracted. There was a study done a few years ago by Dr. Edward Hallowell, and he determined in his study that employers in America were losing $544 billion a year in distraction, that workers were distracted on average about 2 hours out of every working day. He went on with his research and wrote a book about it entitled Driven to Distraction. And in this, he says that we are living a life that is rushed. We bounce back and forth from one project to another. We try to multitask, and we try to get ahead, but most of us are falling further and further behind. There are numerous things that we might point to and say these are our distractions in our life, but he identifies 5 as the main leading causes of distraction in our lives today. The first is something that he calls tech attraction. Now, you know what that is. This is where we get our technology, and constantly we were scrolling on this. We look to see if our Facebook post has been liked by the right people, and we look to see if the wrong people didn't like it, and we make mental notes about things like that. We are constantly getting our news and our text messages, and it distracts us. This little tool allows us to take our work home and our home to work. And so in doing that, we are constantly distracted back and forth. So tech attraction may be one of your issues. We also think about the word multitasking. People think we can do 2 or 3 things at once. You know what the reality is? You cannot do 2 or 3 things at once very well. It's like being an all-weather coat. I remember one time I was the minister of evangelism, youth, and children at a church, and one of the deacons says, that's just like an all-weather coat. It has good names, but it's not worth anything when you need it, And sometimes when we multitask, we recognize that we really aren't doing more than one thing at a time very well, certainly not multiple things. He goes on and talks about idea hopping. Sometimes we have great ideas, but we never follow through. A 5th area of distraction is trying to be in control of the universe. Do you know anybody like that? Do you know anybody? Do you see somebody in the mirror that is sometimes guilty of that? Trying to be in charge of everybody's life. You probably have good intentions, and you probably even have such good insight and wisdom that if the world just listened to you, it would be a better world. I get that. But you can't take care of yourself very well when you're trying to take care of the entire world. So today we are a distracted, disengaged people. We bring our work home in the evenings, and we bring our home projects to work in the morning. And our distractions, as I said earlier, could very well be satanic in origin. I want to invite you to look with me as I read from chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, but you follow along in your text. Now, when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come and let us meet together at Hakkaraphim and near the plain of Ono," but they intended to do me harm. Now, let me just insert here that the plain of Ono was about a day's journey from where Nehemiah was working on the wall. It was an isolated place, and so he would have had to have come down from the wall, spent an entire day in travel, and he would have been in a vulnerable position, not very safe had he gone. And that's one of the lessons that we're going to learn as we continue in this text. Look at verse 3. "And I sent messengers to them, saying, I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" And they sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. Today, I want to share with you about 7 different ways that distractions can be used in a diabolical way against us. I want to talk about the characteristics of distraction, and 4 of them are found in these first 4 verses. Let me give them to you. First, distractions often come at inopportune times. There's never a good opportunity for distraction, is there? In Nehemiah's life, the gates have not been hung. That tells us something about the work done on these walls. The walls are just about finished, but now you've got to go and with some degree of skill, you've got to get those gates hung so that the city will be protected. It's not a complete job yet. It's close to being complete. It's not finished, and that's when the distractions are coming in now for Nehemiah. Have you ever had something like that in your life, a project you're working on, and you can almost see the finish line, and then the phone starts ringing, or then there's a crisis, or then somebody needs your time and attention? Nehemiah probably feels that way. We see that right there in verse 1. Right before the job is done, the distractions start coming in. Here's the second thing. Distractions suggest a seemingly urgent crisis that only you can resolve. I'm going to say that again. I see some of you taking some notes. I want you to get this. Distractions suggest a seemingly urgent crisis that only you can resolve. We see that in the first part of verse 2. Nehemiah, you come down. We need for you to stop what you're doing so that we can go and make sense out of this. Well, Nehemiah's response is great. I can't. I'm doing this great work. Should the great work that God has called me to stand still while I come down to you? No, of course not. Here's the third thing. Distractions are often hazardous to your spiritual health. I'm adding the word spiritual in there. Here we see Nehemiah, if he comes down, if he goes a day's journey out to the plain of Ono in a vulnerable situation, then these guys that are suspect at best will have the upper hand and will be able to overpower Nehemiah, perhaps do him some physical harm. When distractions come your way and mine, when we give our time and attention to those distractions, and we take our eyes off the things that God has called us to do, then it is a hazard to our spiritual health. We're going to find ourselves not having our quiet time, not having our Bible reading time. We're too busy. We're juggling too many things at once. We sleep late, so we don't get up and do our devotional time, or we decide it's a good Sunday to skip church and not be with God's people, or it's a good time for us to perhaps do something to distract us from the distractions. Sometimes that happens in people's lives. So distractions are often hazardous to our spiritual health. And finally, number 4 in this first part of our list today, distractions are usually persistent. How many times did Geshem the Arab and Sanballat, how many times did they send this message or come in person to Nehemiah? 4 times it says right here. But that's not going to be the end. There's going to be another, as we'll see in verse 5. In the same way, Sanballat, for the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. Okay, now, let me tell you what this means. Scrolls would have been how we would have written letters in that day and time. Even a short letter would have been rolled up into a small scroll, and it would have had a seal on it to keep anyone else from reading it until it got to its intended recipient. But this is an open letter. So if it's written on parchment of some type, then it's not even rolled up, and it certainly is not sealed. Why was that? So that everybody could read it. And had it been engraved on a potsherd, a piece of pottery that was used for communicating messages, then as the piece of pottery was carried, everybody who wanted to could look over his shoulder and read this message. So in the same way, Sanballat does this now, 5th time, letter is in hand, it's an unsealed letter, and in it was written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it, "that you and the Jews intend to rebel, and that is why you are building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there's a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now come down and let us take counsel together." Well, the 5th characteristic of distractions is really found in this passage from verse 5 through 7. Distractions can get more exaggerated over time. You see, this kind of takes on a life of its own. It's written in this open letter. Everybody in the area that can see it. It's probably left where people can see it. And it's designed in such a way to build suspicion toward Nehemiah. The longer a distraction is left to kind of have its own life, the more exaggerated that distraction can be. And look at verses 8 and following. "No such thing as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind." Verse 9, he gives an explanation about this. "For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking that their hands will drop from the work and the work won't be done." In other words, those gates will never get hung. And what good is a wall without the gates? But then look at the end of verse 9. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. That's one of several prayers that we see in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a book that records some of the most intimate prayer language of the entire Old Testament. Nehemiah comes in and he says this, he offers this sentence prayer to God, but now, O God, strengthen my hands. Now, when I went to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Metatable, who was confined in his home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. And let us close the doors of the temple, for they're coming to kill you, and they're coming to kill you at night. Now, keep this in mind. The enemy can always use somebody that we trust, in this case, Shemaiah, who had been a trusted friend of Nehemiah's. The enemy can always use a trusted friend to misguide us. And discernment is always called for in the life of godly people. We have to constantly be on guard because the enemy's ways are so wicked. Verse 11, but I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. And I understood and I saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way in sin, so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So we see in verse 14 another short prayer that Nehemiah offers to God, and it's as if he's saying, God, I need you to take care of this. The sixth characteristic of distractions would be this, that distractions offer an ungodly way to respond to a real or an imagined need. Distractions offer an ungodly way. You see, Nehemiah is being told by someone he trusted that we're going to go into the temple and we're going to close the doors. The suggestion there, the reference is to the place that only the high priest could go. And Nehemiah was not the high priest. And he knew that to do something in an ungodly way was wrong. And even though the suggestion was made by somebody he trusted, we know that the enemy can use even people we trust to get us out of God's will. So with incredible discernment, with careful and prayerful discernment, Nehemiah says no to this plan. R.C. Sproul writes that the idea here is to make Nehemiah behave like a coward and a lawbreaker. Let's go into the temple. Let's close the door. That's being a coward. Let's go into the temple where only the priest can go. That's to be a lawbreaker. Because if he can make him both a coward and a lawbreaker, his reputation is going to be ruined and he will lack the support that he needs to get the job of building the wall finished. Nehemiah says, would a man like me go into the temple? He knew that laymen were not allowed. He knew that from reading Numbers chapter 18, verse 7, if you're kind of putting a little reference there. Maybe you remember the story of King Uzziah, who was stricken by leprosy because he went into the temple where he was not supposed to go. But look now at the final summary. We see this in verse 15 and following through the end of the chapter, it's really a summary of what has already happened in this 6th chapter. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. And when all of our enemies heard of it, the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. And for many in Judah, they were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shekinah, the son of Era. His son Jehoahan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. And they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. So here's the final characteristic of distractions. Our enemy uses everything he can to distract you and me from experiencing the glory of God. The enemy doesn't want you and me to see God's glory. He doesn't want us to think of a God who is high and lifted up, who is on his throne, who is sovereign, who is in control, who in his wisdom and his care and his grace toward us has everything like a Romans 8:28 moment in store and planned for us. Our enemy doesn't want us to know that. So if he can distract us, and the distraction that we see in these verses, you see all those names that you kind of like to skip over when you're reading them. Well, the reason those names are there is they're all important people. And sometimes the enemy will say, well, you've got to pay attention to the important movers and shakers. You can't get your work done if you're not well connected. Listen. The only connection you and I need as a child of God is a connection that is found on our knees with an open book called the Bible, with God's people, when we say, God, I need your help. Well, the distractions that Nehemiah faced remind us of the deceitfulness of Satan, the great enemy. Jesus would say of Satan, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do. Now, he's saying this to the Pharisees, but his reference is here to Satan. You're of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. He does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And aren't you thankful that Martin Luther got it right when he gave us the wonderful words to that immortal hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can, what is the next word? Endure. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. That word is Jesus Christ. Nehemiah provides a 3-step strategy to deal with minor distractions and with major attacks by the enemy. Here's what you need to know today. The next time a distraction comes your way, remember, go back to your calling and stay the course. Remember your calling. Remember what's important. You have been saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, and you have been commissioned to go and make disciples. That's it. Remember your calling and stay the course. Nehemiah doesn't fight back. He uses only enough words to his enemies to declare his intentions. He knows the power of one of my favorite verses of Scripture, Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be silent. You ever had anybody that you just, they're just making your life miserable? Well, talk to God about that person. That's all you have to do. Talk to God about that person. And we see this as the second part of Nehemiah's strategy. Our first and our last weapon in the battle is prayer. It's the first thing Nehemiah does. It's the last thing Nehemiah does. That's a good example for you and me. Until we have prayed, we have not done the hard work of anything related to revitalization. Until we have prayed, we haven't begun to do the work of standing up for God and focusing on those things that He's called us to do. Until we have prayed, and not until we have finished everything in prayer is God ready to show His glory through us. And what Nehemiah does is he recognizes the strategy of the enemy, and he prays specifically, God, give me the strength to be faithful. And he asks God to remember those who've come against him, and he leaves them in God's hands. And here's the third thing Nehemiah does. He trusts God, and he obeys, and he knows what God has said. And because of that, Nehemiah prevails. This part of the story, the gospel, if you will, that we see in the book of Nehemiah is this, that the part of the story in chapter 6 reminds us that God does not always intervene to prevent you and me from facing attack. Okay? How many of you wish He would? Okay? But God doesn't always do that. He doesn't always intervene to prevent attack. But what He does is He always gives strength to the child of God when attacks are coming. And we learn to pray, and we learn to trust, and we learn to obey in ways that we would never do otherwise if God in His understanding, God in His sovereign will, God in His perfect plan, God in His grace did not say, I'm letting this happen. I'm letting you walk through a test. And as you do this, you're going to grow and you're going to get closer to me than you've ever imagined. The Christian life will always be challenged by opposition. And we must simply remember that every challenge gives us the chance to grow stronger. It may be conflict in a church. It may be busyness. It may be disappointment. It may be the criticism that leaders sometimes hear. These are always ways in which the enemy of the gospel attempts to distract and discourage us from the work of the Great Commission. And the next time those things happen in your life, the next time you are tempted to be distracted, you have a very simple answer, and it is this: we have work to do, and we cannot come down from the wall. And if you believe that today, would you say amen? Amen.